In wake of the attacks on the Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh the other day, commentator Ben Shapiro from the Daily Wire, who is considered pretty far to the right, I wouldn't say as far as like Trump or like any of the alt-right, but he's definitely an establishment, pretty far right Ted Cruz like conservative, fairly religious except not in the Christian way, as you'll see here. He decided to comment on anti-Semitism from the attacks of the Pittsburgh shooting, but one might think he's going to bash the right wingers and the anti Semitic right wing, but as you'll see, things take a twist.
President Trump, as I say, has separated from the alt-right in dramatic ways. So the first 3 points that I've made here, President Trump did wink and nod at the alt-right for 2 years. 2, white supremacism not the same as alt-right MAGA. 3, President Trump has separated from the alt-right in dramatic ways, and they are pissed at him over it. Okay, that is true of this shooter, too, who is anti-Trump. Fourth, if we're going to talk about flirting with anti-Semites and anti-Semitic rhetoric, and this making things less safe for Jews, then let's actually talk about that. Who do you think has made the world less safe for Jews? President Trump and his winking and nodding at the alt-right, or the left, which mainstreams Louis Farrakhan, which mainstreams Linda Sarsour, which mainstreams the BDS movement, which mainstreams wildly anti-Israel and anti-Semitic policies? Which one do you think is more damaging to Jews all across the world and in the United States? Which one do you think is leading to more mainstream anti-Semitism? Do you think it's the party that might have removed Jerusalem, tried to remove Jerusalem in 2012 from their platform? Or is it the party that moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and Israel? Do you think that it's the party standing up for religious freedom, or do you think that it's the party looking to obliterate religious freedom in the name of so-called anti-discrimination? Do you think that it's the party that mainlines Keith Ellison and tries to make him head of the DNC after he refuses and spends years backing Louis Farrakhan? Or do you think that it might be the party that opposes that? Mainstream members of the Democratic Party routinely hobnob with anti-Semites. Not just hobnob with them, agree with them. This is true on the European left as well. Folks like Jeremy Corbyn in Britain expressing their sympathy for what happened in Pittsburgh. Go F yourself, dude. No one is interested in what a Hamas supporter has to say about Jews being shot in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. See, for the Jewish community, really, for Jews who really care about being Jewish, there is not a whit of difference between a Jew being murdered for being a Jew in Jerusalem, a Jew being murdered for being Jewish in France, or a Jew being murdered for being Jewish in Pittsburgh. It's all of a piece. And for folks on the left who suggest that the death of a Jew in Jerusalem is different than the death of a Jew in Pittsburgh for anti-Semitic reasons, those people are part of the problem. And so if we're going to talk about anti-Semitic rhetoric and who's to blame for a rise in Jewish deaths the world over, a rise in hate crimes the world over, then let's actually talk about it. I don't think the left wants to talk about that. I think what they want is partisan hackery. A little more on this in just a second. Let's be clear about this. When President Trump tried to wink and nod at the alt-right, he was taking a fringe group that was non-associated with the conservative movement, and he was winking and nodding at them for political purposes, and then he tossed them out on their ear, which is why they're angry with him. The mainstream Democratic Party and the left in this country have decided that it is perfectly fine to hobnob with people who support anti-Semitic terrorism. They've decided that's okay. I'm not blaming those folks for what happened in Pittsburgh. That's not their fault either. But if we're going to talk about rhetoric and its impact on anti-Jewish sentiment the world over, I'm going to go with the folks who every time there's a war in the Gaza Strip suggest that Jews the world over are to blame, or suggest that Israel is to blame for defending itself, or suggest that when Jews are attacked at a kosher supermarket in France, that's a random attack. If we're going to condemn rhetoric, let's condemn rhetoric. I'm happy to separate rhetoric from violence. I'm happy to do that on all sides. But if we're going to talk rhetoric, you have to condemn rhetoric when it happens, where it happens, and from whom it comes. Okay, I condemned President Trump when he was candidate Trump doing this nonsense with the alt-right. I did it over and over and over. I've done the same thing with folks on the left. I don't see anyone on the left doing the same thing to folks on the left. I see them only doing it to folks on the right for partisan political reasons. That's all I'm seeing. I'm seeing a bunch of people who don't give a good damn when a Jew gets killed in Jerusalem, popping out of the woodwork to say that the right is responsible for what just happened in Pittsburgh, all the while championing an Iran deal that will lead to the annihilation of millions of people if the Iranians have their way. That is partisanship. That is disgusting partisanship.
Okay, so that was definitely an interesting take on what happened in Pittsburgh, but mainly this shows, and I know a lot of people don't actually talk about this, how Ben Shapiro, he's the master of this tactic in debate known as gish galloping. For those who know anything about debate and professional debate, they may have just like squirmed a bit or cringed at that term. So, for those who don't know, gish galloping is when you have a certain amount of time for each person to talk, and the person making the arguments makes an insane amount of points, rapid fire, and so many that the other person can't respond. And then when they're tallying up points, the person who can't respond to all of them has to give away some points because he wasn't able to respond to them in time, and it's really trolley tactic, and that's essentially what Ben Shapiro is doing here. See, there was 4 minutes of him talking, and he covered 17 different things. He somehow goes from talking about President Donald Trump and the alt-right to talk about why the Iran deal is supposedly going to kill millions of people, and as a result, I can't talk about all of it. But the first thing I want to talk about is his bashing of BDS, which for those who don't know is boycott, divest, and sanction. Now, I personally think it should be rephrased to BTS, boycott, tariff, and sanction, not just for the amazing branding with BTS, the K-pop band. For those who don't know, might get a lot of traction in the mainstream if it's framed that way, but also because economic tariffs to put pressure on nations is always welcome, especially in the pressure way, not the actual trade way. So, framing BDS as anti-Semitic honestly is just a cop-out and a bit of use of identity politics, especially since, for example, BDS, the most famous time it was used was in the 80s, 90s during South Africa, when South Africa was still committing apartheid to their black majority from the white minority. And if you were to say BDS during back then in the 80s and 90s against South Africa was racist towards white people, you'd be quite the idiot. So BDS, the reason Ben Shapiro, many, especially whenever Netanyahu hears BDS, he screams at the top of his lungs about how it's anti-Semitic. The reason they're so afraid is because it genuinely works. Once BDS happened in South Africa, they immediately started getting rid of apartheid over there because it flat out works, and that is, as a side note, how you should pressure nations instead of just flat out declaring war on them like Bush does for Iraq. So, another thing he talked about was removing Jerusalem from the options during 2012 and how many Democrats still don't think that moving the embassy is a good idea, and many say they do, but then walk out of it like Obama did. The main reason, it's not because of anti-Semitism, Ben Shapiro. The main reason why people don't want to move the embassy to Jerusalem is because that would mean recognizing it as just Israel's, and especially when the Israel-Palestine debate is heated as it is, you don't want it to get any more heated than it already is, and have fire break out on both sides that you since you caused it, and you're the largest nation in the world, most powerful, you don't want to then have to take even more responsibility in trying to clean up the mess that you've already helped create. So it's not anti-Semitism, as Ben Shapiro tries to frame it, it's just being smart and cautious and not trying to escalate a situation. Another thing, Jeremy Corbyn, this one is just the most annoying, trying to frame European left-wingers like Jeremy Corbyn. The main reason this is being brought back up into the mainstream discussion is because Jeremy Corbyn the other day launched an attack on large CEOs of banks and executives from banking companies. I think Goldman Sachs was the main one, but many British ones as well. And that ad, it was quite good. I might show it another time, but the main argument against that after Jeremy Corbyn talked, since there was really nothing factual or even in general that you could bring up as an ethical reason of what Jeremy Corbyn said was wrong, people just started framing it as, oh, you mean the rich Jews? And Jeremy Corbyn didn't even mention the word Jew once in them there, but that just shows how the Jewish people, and especially Ben Shapiro, like to play the victimhood in this situation. Now, finally, just talking about him as a whole and the whole religious freedom thing, that one especially gets on my nerves when you play the semantics game and try to use semantics to make your side more favorable instead of calling it racism, just calling it religious freedom instead of discrimination. As you saw, once again, back in the 60s, they used the argument of religious freedom for segregation. And I definitely don't think Ben Shapiro supports segregation. So if if you can't discriminate against black people, you shouldn't be able to discriminate against gay people if you're going into a Christian bakery or a Muslim bakery or a Jewish bakery or any bakery. And overall, this just shows how Ben Shapiro is playing to his identity politics once again and trying to frame the left as racist and become partisan in the fact that he's framing the left as anti-Semites and won't even go after right-wingers. It's quite disgusting and shows how he's a hypocrite, especially in that segment where he was bashing partisanship even though he himself is a rank partisan hack.